My name is Moses Kulaba, and I can say bonjour, abarigani, and I hope that all of you are well today. We want on behalf of the organizers to thank you so much for joining us on this very important webinar. Friends and colleagues from all over here joining us, you know that this war has been going on for a while. When it started, we did not know how far it would go, but barely a few months into the war, we have seen the consequences beyond our borders. With over 15,000 people died in Russia, I mean in Ukraine, we have seen the impact beyond the borders of Europe. As I speak right now, the cost of living in Africa has increased, and all of us are sort of guessing what will be the next course. We are very delighted this afternoon to have a very distinguished panel who will be joining us to share with us the impacts of this war, what exactly it means, and how Africa should be positioning ourselves. The cost of crude oil and all the other essentials have risen, but there are also some opportunities and also some risks that we are facing from this war. I'm very delighted to be joined with a very distinguished panel, which is going to help us to sort of really navigate through these challenges, but also to help us to answer some of the questions as we see them. Without wasting a lot of time, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, let me go ahead and introduce to you our speakers. We are delighted to have Dr. Anita Kiamba, who is joining us from the University of Nairobi. We'll also be having Mr. Ayuk Ayuk, who is the Executive Director for the African Energy Chamber. We'll also be pleased to have Mr. Frederick Kabanda from Africa Development Bank and Mr. Silas Olang from the Natural Resources Governance Institute. All these are distinguished professionals, but also practitioners in different ways, and we could not have been much more delighted and much more privileged than having them today. As I said, my name is Moses Kulaba. I'm the East Africa General Manager, and my role today will be just to moderate this session. Without wasting time, let me bring to you our first distinguished panelist, who is none other than Dr. Anita Kiamba. Dr. Anita Kiamba is a senior lecturer at the Department of Diplomacy and International Studies at the University of Nairobi. She holds a PhD in International Studies from the University of Nairobi. She has served in this profession for a long time. She's a distinguished scholar, a trainer, but also a practitioner on matters of peace and conflict. And of course, researched widely, but also spoken widely at different panels on matters relating to international relations, but also on matters relating to foreign policy analysis, and also on matters relating to peace and conflict. Without wasting a lot of time, at this point, may I welcome Dr. Anita Kiamba to kick us off.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone and fellow panelists. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this important webinar that discusses extractive resources in Africa. I was requested to discuss the following: how Africa can navigate the Russia-Ukraine war and build resilience while ensuring that our human security are not compromised. And of course, the main focus here is on Africa. There's much to say about this entire framework when we get into identifying the issues of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, but I'll not get too much into it because I bet by now we are all well adjusted in terms of understanding the causes and the reasons why the conflict is there. So my role basically is to take you a bit more further in terms of how Africa can readjust itself and can deal with the issues as they come about, because of course we are also affected by that particular conflict. In my mind, it is important to note first and foremost, because, as a scholar, I would want to go back, to a bit of history, but contemporary history. It is important to note that first and foremost, Africa has been building resilience since the 1994 UNDP report that accentuated threats to human security. So we are not new to this. We were left on our own after the Cold War to come up with our own ideas and how we can deal with frameworks that more or less support our ideas and what is likely to happen to us. However, though, since the last few months, one can actually go back to 2020, the current decade, Africa and the rest of the globe woke up to new realities from quite a number of other shocks, not only the Ukraine-Russia war, but first and foremost, COVID-19. That in itself lent a shock to us. And that shock in itself is something that we were able to get out of, but we have seen reversal of what has happened thereafter. The other shock since 2020 is that of climate change. Not that it just began in 2020, but we are part and parcel of the framework of readjusting and understanding what we need to do in the current environment. So one would think about not only of climate change, COVID-19 or post-COVID-19, but also currently the effects that are reverberating in Africa currently because of the Russia and Ukraine war. And that is where I'm here to discuss that particular issue. Now, all these are further compounded by the heat and the restraints of the socioeconomic progress that we have made since 2020 or 2021. So how do we get out of that? And what do we foresee ourselves in the future? Given that there are quite a number of reverberations and quite a number of conflicts that we have to deal with, not necessarily found in Africa, like have been in the past. So how are we going to readjust ourselves with these global trends in the international system? One of the things from a political economic standpoint and from a conflict and even peace and conflict standpoint is that the current war continues to shape and reshape global alliances by highlighting Russia's central role in the energy sector. We cannot fail to identify Russia as being, the main, not only protagonist, but also being part and parcel of that country that we often go to, not only for our food security, but also for our energy resources. So having said that, what are we supposed to do in Africa? Should we continue remain being reliant on the external forces, or what are we supposed to do? And also how are we supposed to adjust, given that this particular conflict will continue to affect us as we are. What we've seen is that we've witnessed an increase in global oil and gas prices. And this in itself has also led to the increase of the cost of living in developing countries, and more particularly in Africa. We've also experienced inflation, all of which have decelerated socioeconomic growth and political growth in Africa. Indeed, as late as the last few days, we are seeing what is happening in South Asia, and more particularly Sri Lanka. And some of our countries and our analysts are beginning to rethink about the intensity, not only of the political issues, but also of the global issues that are going to lend some of these strains to us and our communities. So where do we go from now? How can Africa build resilience and cushion the effects of the war? Remember, like I've said, since 1994, we already got into that idea that there's the UNDP report. These are the human security issues. Scholars went around identifying various aspects of human security and how we can move forth in terms of building a sustainable environment and also region. But all these shocks have now come back, and they are not, extrapolated in the African environment. So how do we deal with that? We are good at dealing with our own shocks, when it comes to conflict and its management. But suddenly there has been a shift, not necessarily a paradigm shift, but a shift in terms of focusing on the rest of the world and what we are supposed to do in terms of cushioning our effects or effects from what happens in the international system. So how can we organize ourselves better to ensure that we have been able to identify areas where we need more growth, where we need more development, where we need more strength in terms of building partnerships internationally and the like? So the first thing that we have to understand before I give you, because I came up with 4, I didn't want this to be a lecture. I came up with 4 areas that Africa needs to zone in and focus on in terms of the political economy of the region. But first, before I get into that, we need to understand the consequences of the increase of the oil prices when it comes to food prices and other commodities. We know that most of Africa is fragile in the sense of committing to food security. Never mind that we have arable land. But this has shown us really that there's more that we can do when it comes to the food prices, food security, and also the oil prices that more or less lead to the motion of all these other issues that are also affecting us. We also have to go beyond and think about the poorer communities in Africa and how that in itself can create more crises in Africa. So what are we left with? We are left with about 4 options that I identify, and I think it would be better for us to discuss that as we think about where Africa's resilience is in this particular matter. The first is that of regional cooperation and trade. We know for a long period of time, since the 1980s or since some of our nations were independent, we were relying heavily on some of the agreements that we'd already undertaken with other nations. But with the creation of the World Trade Organization, or the reconstitution of the World Trade Organization, we had to rethink about where is the place of Africa, how do we better negotiate, and what are the things that will lead us forward when it comes to some of the issues that we have to deal with. So we have been quite progressive because we are seeing how Africa can use the continental free trade area as a vehicle in order to access affordable oil, gas, food, and other resources that we currently use and that currently are being restrained because of the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Remember, once again, while talking about regional cooperation and trade, we are far behind somewhat, because when it comes to the global value chains, we are in the lower stream. But that gives us an opportunity, because again, at that lower stream, this is where you find a lot of marketing, where we find a lot of consumption. And Africa is a high consumption of many commodities that we don't produce. Market commodities that we also do not manufacture. So one would suggest really that it's time for Africa to work once again, or to get back onto that train of movement and see how we can better reshape our ideas in order to be resilient, given that some of the resources that we are using are from other regions altogether, yet we manufacture and produce those same commodities. So it is time for us, beyond that, to even market some of those alternatives when it comes to food and energy sources. We know that this can not only be in the long term, but also in the short term. Related to that is, secondly, energy innovation and new technology. We are not far behind, because we have realized there's need for us in Africa to focus our sights on energy innovation. We have all it takes when it comes to the other sources of energy, particularly developing strategies through STEM research, through TVETs. These are basically training and vocational education training centers and the like, that are readily open for us to explore the varieties of us to use in lieu of the current crisis, particularly the oil and food crisis that we have. So all this can basically, we can use in terms of the renewable and sustainable energy resources that we do have in Africa. This does not mean that we do not have those resources. Those are there in Africa, plentiful, and we've not really adopted too much. Indeed, when you look at what Africa consumes in terms of energy, we put hydroelectricity at the forefront, and that requires a lot of oil and gas because of the turbines and so on, which I'll not get into. But ultimately, there's solar and geothermal energy that we can more or less use to assist us, in not only the short term, but also the long term of the issues that we do have. Next, or third, is the prudential use of non-renewable resources. Every once in a while, we are told about the movement from MDGs, or Millennium Development Goals, to Sustainable Development Goals, where we are currently. So what are we doing in terms of those resources, adopting those resources to us? We know that the MDGs more or less moved on without some of us really acclimatizing to all the 8 points. Currently, we've got more points. And one of those points is, how do we use sustainable energy for our benefit? Now that has got its own issues, because we have to think about, again, currently, about the infrastructural support that non-renewable resources lend us in Africa, particularly in easing and facilitating transportation, especially in urban and peri-urban areas where oil and gas is really felt, because we are heavy consumers in the urban areas and the peri-urban areas of oil and gas. So how then can we cushion our populations? How can we cushion ourselves? I believe one of the major ways that we can do, not only in the long term, but also short to medium term, is to reallocate resources to transportation, to infrastructural development, so that those of us who are going without fuel at times in our countries, or there's a high cost of fuel, which in turn leads to the high cost of energy in terms of food security and the like, can be decreased. And we need to act fast, really, when it comes to all this, because we do not want to see ourselves going in the way that other regions have gone, and particularly, like I mentioned earlier, South Asia, and more particularly Sri Lanka. It gives us more insight for us to better understand, the cracking point of societies who are compounded by the high cost of living. And of course, this has got nothing to do at times with the people themselves, but of course, there's a lot of pressure and triggers. And one of the triggers is the oil and gas, and the sustainability of that in our developing nations. Next, and hopefully lastly, is we need to ultimately strategize and strategically organize ourselves. We are not out of the wood yet. We've just recovered from COVID. We've slowly started recovering from COVID, only to be met, of course, with this other international, of course, effects of the Russian and Ukrainian war, which everyone is actually feeling the heat. There's need for us to have those global strategies and think about the global alliances and shifts that are happening around the world. And in my mind, what I'm seeing is that for Africa, we need to more or less look at what is happening in other developing countries. We've often talked about the South-South and how we can work with other developing countries like India, when it comes to food security, when it comes to ensuring that we've alleviated the pressure that comes along with the increased prices of oil and gas. And also Brazil, what are the options that we have? I think the options are there in Africa, but what we need to do is to strategically think about them and implement those policies, because we are good at coming up with ideas, but when it comes to implementing the policies, we may be left far behind in terms of how we are going about that. But this is the crunch time, because we cannot afford to lose that opportunity, particularly now that we have adverse effects when it comes to oil and gas, when it comes to food security. The time is now. This is when we need to actually innovate and come up with innovative ideas to help us move along and not always be the bane or be the ones who are affected by some serious effects internationally. So we must look at those opportunities and also the costs associated with developing those opportunities for Africa. Beyond that, what else I see as a conflict studies scholar is to look at how we can better manage ourselves in terms of negotiation. We are often left far behind. We know indeed that we've got several rounds of negotiations. Others have never been fulfilled. So this is the time to go back to the drawing board, see how we can negotiate better, how we can have various partners that can help us also cushion the current failures of the international system, and also what we are being affected by when it comes to the war. So I think with that, maybe short and few ideas, I think I'll end it there. Thank you so much, Moses Kulaba.
Indeed, thank you so much. Indeed, thank you so much, Dr. Kyiamba, for that precise and elaborative political economy analysis of this war, and essentially how it affects us and how it has evolved over the years. And perhaps pointing out also some of the kind of things that perhaps we should be taking as takeaways from this war. I like the fact that you actually mentioned that the war definitely sort of has ushered in a new era in international relations, and perhaps an era that all of us as Africa, but also as a continent in our different capacities should be looking up to and think about how best we reposition ourselves. That's quite exciting indeed. And I think it's the best way to connect with the next part of this discussion, which is now trying deep into the energy sector and see exactly what kind of position that we need to take as far as the energy sector is concerned. As most of you are aware, globally, as we mentioned earlier, since when this war has started, there has been a spike in energy prices, and particularly bringing a risk when it comes to issues on matters relating to energy security. Indeed, as we speak, most people have argued and said, perhaps maybe this is an opportunity for Africa to feed in. But also we see, as you mentioned rightly, Dr. Kyiamba, that most of the European consumers previously who were relying on Russia looking up to Africa. What are the opportunities that are there? And the question that we will all face is, can really Africa fill in the gap that Russia is leaving from Europe? And how long can this go? So for us to be able to answer this question in detail, let me bring in Mr. Ayuk. Mr. Ayuk, as I said, is a distinguished profession and practitioner in this sector. Mr. Ayuk is a founder and CEO of the Pan-African corporate law conglomerate called Central Africa Group. But most importantly, is the founder and executive chairman of the African Energy Chamber, and also an author who has written so many books on matters relating to the energy sector. Mr. Ayuk, I think as of last that I knew him, he had also authored the book, which is very famous now, called Billions at Play, where he has also discussed a number of issues relating to the energy sector, but also he has also talked about issues about OPEC and how best Africa can be positioned. Mr. Ayuk has worked with different firms. He has also advised different companies, but also he has also advised different governments in the region on matters related to energy. With that, I want to yield over the floor to Mr. Ayuk by just starting off and saying, Mr. Ayuk, what we are hearing, is this true? And how best can we position ourselves?
Moses, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I could not be more honored to be on the same panel with Dr. Kyiamba. I think you don't do it this justice to have me speaking after her. But I do believe that this is a time when we need to have a big reflection. And it's the one thing I would agree with Dr. Kyiamba is that food security is as important to us as Africans as energy security. I think when you have both combined, and I always say energy drives a lot of things and how we move forward. And I think the crisis in Russia has really brought a lot of that out. But also it's a time when we have to deal with calls around the world, where we stand as a continent on how we want to engage in the different kind of energies and where we go as a future. We're talking about having the real kind of negotiations and the real kind of discussions. The real questions we got to ask ourselves is, where are we positioning ourselves and the kind of negotiation that we need to have? Are those discussions going to be centered around a just energy transition, not just a transition? And I'll tell you why. Africa as a continent has produced 2.73 greenhouse gas emissions. If you take South Africa and some of the Northern African countries out, we are, sub-Saharan Africa is at basically 0.05 greenhouse gas emissions. That means that we have not contributed a lot, and we have a firm belief that we should not be paying a bigger price to fix the world's problems. It is called global warming, not Africa warming. So Africa has to be part of that solution, but not be the only part of that solution. So this curbing on stopping financing going into Africa gas projects or Africa energy projects needs to stop. But at the bigger stage, we all have to embrace that world that we live in. And the context of where we see ourselves right now with Russia and Ukraine crisis, we are once again getting caught up in that crossroads. Those crossroads, that means that issues around energy poverty, that a lot of Africans cannot have access to electricity. I want you to stop and think about this for a minute. 600 million Africans today do not have any access to electricity. 900 million don't have access to clean cooking, most of them women. They are still stuck. But also the disparities is something that existed before the war in Russia and Ukraine, and how it affects our own energy security. Everybody around Europe today and around the world is searching for gas and African natural resources at this very moment, because they want to turn away, they want to look at that security. I know there are those who have been very critical of me personally and some of the work that we do at the chamber, of saying we're clinging on to fossil fuels and oil and gas. Fair enough. I think that's fair. We live in a new Africa and a more free Africa, so we should be allowed to be, people should be allowed to be critical. But I think being critical, sometimes we have to take stock of where we stand and our own issues around development. The irony that a lot of people who are being critical of us live in some of the wealthiest countries that have used oil and natural gas to grow their economies and build their economies, and then turn to us and say, you don't have the right to. I was lucky to be one of the few Africans to be invited to speak at COP26 last year. And after COP26 last year, we had all the pledges of where we're going to go. But then 2 months after, Norway handed out 52 oil licenses. The UK announced that they're going to open coal plants the first time in about 30 years. Germany is doing the same. The US opened all federal lands for drilling. And also we saw climate mitigation funds that were promised to African countries to help them cope with this have still not been done. It's not an energy transition. We need to be asking for a just energy transition, even at this time when there is a war, because the same people are saying, given the wars in Ukraine, they have to do this because of their energy security, because energy security is national security. We in Africa need to be looking at energy security as a national security issue, because we have so many young people that need a fighting chance in their life. And we all are tired of seeing our brothers and sisters having to cross the Mediterranean to search for greener pastures in Europe, or going to Dubai, or trying to go into foreign countries. We can create those opportunities at home. We can drive those dialogues at home. But also, most importantly, this is a time when African governments need to step up. We need to put some skin in the game. We need to cut out the ills of the past. We need to encourage a more business environment that encourages growth, that creates opportunity. But then we also need to deal with issues that we don't want to talk about: corruption and mismanagement. That has really killed a lot of our economies. And even right now, where some are seeing windfalls and benefits coming out of this, maybe oil prices or gas prices out of this war right now, corruption and mismanagement still continues to drive a lot of our public institutions. And that is really going to put us back. So while I look forward to having these discussions, I want us to have an open mind and open hearts to really embrace them, because at the end of the day, we are all Africans, and we have to drive that would drive up our industry and our continent. Because I always say this: those who want to see us down, they are not opposed to it. It's not about opposed to an industry. It's about driving up an industry and creating opportunities. And young people around this continent, now more than ever, they are restless, they are impatient. So what are you dealing with? Food security, climate change, energy poverty, all of them are two sides of the same coin, and we need to address them both. We have a rare opportunity to reshape the future. And I invite all of you to be active participants in that dialogue. You don't have to agree with me. You just have to do what you believe in and do it better. That's how we'll build the Africa that we deserve. So thank you so much. And I look forward to answering any questions or interacting with other panelists on this. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Ayuk, for putting up those kind of perspectives as well. And perhaps what is very important, what you're bringing across is saying, look, there could be a crisis, but I think there also has to be some thoughts about this crisis. And also what you're also putting forward is that maybe it's not the end for fossils. given the kind of crisis that we have at the moment, it's time as well for us to begin thinking in terms of other opportunities which are there, but also still clicking on forces like oil and gas for now, as we look forward and try to strategize ourselves. That's a very important discussion. You also mentioned issues around just transition, and especially how the current crisis and the current kind of the global dynamics and the kind of things that we see around the world have affected us, even as a continent, if we are, as we are not the source of that. But I think a very important point that you raised is in terms of how do we position ourselves as a continent to see how that we make best of that, and how our governments need to address some of the systematic issues and challenges that we have faced as a continent to be able to sort of really address the deficits that we see. I'll be coming to you, back to you with a question in terms of exactly how can we be able to fill in that gap. And I hope that with time, we can be able to have for you to answer that question and help our audience sort of really be able to reposition ourselves and fix ourselves in this big picture. Can we, as an African continent, be able to fill in the gap that is being left by Russia in this war? I think that's a question that I'll ask you later to answer. And without wasting a lot of time, let me now bring in another distinguished panelist to help us sort of really carry forward and move forward a discussion that has been sort of sparked off by Dr. Anita Kyiamba and Mr. Ayuk, in terms when it comes to the practicalities of the realities of what they are saying. When we look at Africa as a continent, can we be able to sort of rise to the call and be able to sort of really be able to play the kind of role that Dr. Kyiamba and Mr. Ayuk is talking about? Without wasting time, let me bring to you Mr. Silas Olang. Silas Olang is the Africa Co-Director at NRJ. He covers a number of countries, including Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda, and other Africa Anglophone countries. Mr. Olang is an economist by background, but he's also a scholar, a researcher, and as I've just mentioned, also a manager. He has spoken widely and written widely about this subject, and one of his research blogs was sort of really seeking to address particularly this gap with some questions that he was raising and saying, look, there could be some opportunities, but there are also some challenges that Africa needs to address. Without wasting a lot of time, may I bring to you Mr. Silas. Mr. Silas, welcome.
Thank you very much, Moses, and good morning, good afternoon, distinguished fellow panelists and participants wherever you're joining from across the globe. Moses, before addressing your question, and given that you kind of postponed the question to NJ, let me provide a bit of a context to the question. I think prior to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, Europe was already importing about 45% of its annual gas and 25% of its oil from Russia. And if you convert that in numbers, you find that the gas was at about 150 billion cubic meters imported from Russia. Now, EU, in response to the crisis, according to the Repower EU plan, aims to cut 2/3 of Russian gas imports by end of 2022. And that is equivalent to about 100 billion cubic meters. And the remaining 50 billion cubic meters to be replaced by 2030. And from that timeline, it is very clear that Europe is seeking actually a short-term injection of additional oil and gas up to 2030. So that is basically the timeline we are looking at. And if any opportunity needs to be grabbed between now and 2030. So this seems to be also in sync with its plans around reduced gas consumption by 2030, basically by reducing consumption through energy efficiency and so forth. So that being the case, I think getting now back to your question, whether this is really an opportunity, looking at that timeline, some African, oil and gas producers may definitely benefit from this short-term opportunity. However, the reality is rather complex and unlikely to match the hype we see among Africa and European political leaders. So several established producer countries, such as Algeria, Angola, Nigeria, are likely to benefit from this opportunity. And in fact, as we speak, they are already reaping higher revenues from soaring global oil and gas prices. However, I think most of these, countries have limited spare capacity. And this is a major challenge. So they cannot really quickly ramp up additional supply, and therefore will need substantial investment before they can actually be able to increase their capacity beyond their current level of production. And of recent, I think we have seen EU engaging many of these countries seeking to strike the deal. And just to pick few, you will see that they are focusing more on established producers that I mentioned. So Angola, we've seen signing declaration of intent for increased cooperation on gas exploration, production, and trading. And also in Algeria, where we see, like Eni and Sonatrach, which is an Algerian, national company, signing a deal to accelerate the development of gas fields in Algeria to increase, country's gas export capacity. So again, without increased capacity, there is a challenge. We also see in other countries like Egypt, where the tripartite agreement between Egypt, Israel, and the EU signed recently, again, looking into building the infrastructure to be able to supply gas to Europe. Nigeria as well, ongoing negotiations to secure investment in gas transport infrastructure, particularly the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline. That could send, quite significant, gas to Europe every year. So, just to mention that capacity is really a key obstacle to Africa established producers, even established producers, to be able to capture this opportunity. But also there is another category of countries that we should look at, the countries with projects that are due to start within the next year or so. And again, focusing on the timeline of 2030, such as Mauritius and Senegal, also are likely to benefit from this short window. There are other potential or emerging, producers countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, are honestly, I think they are unlikely to capture this short window of opportunity, given the delays in negotiations in Tanzania for LNG and also security concerns in Mozambique. So it has historically taken sub-Saharan Africa around 12 years, to move from discovery to production. So again, for these countries to be able to capture the 2030 timeline, I think the chances are quite limited. It is also important to take into consideration the fact that Europe is not only looking to Africa to fill the gap. The EU has already advanced some deals, for short-term supply, including the political agreement with the US, for additional import of at least 15 billion cubic meters in 2022, and of course projecting that to about 50 billion cubic meter annually until at least 2030, which would actually cover all of the EU planned increased LNG supply. And therefore, meaning there may not be any opportunity really for other emerging producers in this case. And this is an area where I think clarity would be very, very important on what it means in terms of really what is the opportunity in terms of the size of gas and oil supply to Europe. So we also see in that context, German signing, the 20-year agreement, which is relatively longer term for the supply of LNG, and also, multiple additional US LNG projects are also ready, really for development, and European leaders also, trying to strike some deals in the Middle East too. So I think many of these producers have more spare capacity than the African producers. So in that case, I would say probably the opportunity is there, but limited and for only few. Now, briefly on green transition, which also was part of the question. So let us look at the green minerals. What is happening there? I think both Russia and Ukraine are also key, suppliers of green minerals used in the manufacture of green technologies such as solar panel, wind turbine, and vehicle batteries. So Europe also seeks to expand its use of clean energy, and this is an opportunity, I think, to develop new form of long-term energy partnership with Africa. And it should ensure that Africa really use these minerals and sign the deals that would actually ensure, that Africa receives good and fair deals, rather than locking, the producers into long-term contracts that might not be really good for the continent. But also, I think Africa should seriously consider developing regional green value chain using the huge potential of green minerals or transition minerals that the continent has. It would therefore, I would therefore conclude, that European energy supply challenge is unlikely to be an absolute African opportunity, as many would think so. The opportunity is for existing producers of country, of course, with additional capacity of those with projects close to start production. But irrespective of how Europe proceeds, officials in both established and prospective producers, in Africa, should soberly evaluate the long-term uncertainties. And I think this is also in line with previous speakers about really Africa trying to reflect on what is really best for the continent. So while prices are soaring now, I think there is an unpredictability in terms of possible fewer supply opportunities and lower prices over time, especially in the context of looming global recession. The price trend might change anytime. So also in touching on the just energy transition, I think the EU should reduce rather than increase import from countries such as US, Qatar, and so forth, as these wealthier countries should be among the first to cut production in a just fossil fuel phase out. So if we talk about just energy transition, we should also look into who should be the last to benefit from the remaining carbon budget. Should it be wealthy countries or poor countries, the developing countries, which actually have the minimal contribution to greenhouse gas emissions so far. Lastly, I think it is important also to ensure that robust governance frameworks are in place to ensure transparency, inclusiveness, and in these deals. An emergency response approach that I see happening now is likely to lead into rollback in compliance with a global best governance standards. So I think those are the few remarks, and I look forward to have more conversation. I'm happy to respond to the question. Thank you very much. Over to you, Moses.
Thank you so much indeed, Silas, for those very interesting insights about this war, and particularly your angle when it comes to the ability of Africa actually to rise up this occasion. And with that comment, maybe let me just go back to Mr. Ayuk before I go to Fred. Do you agree, Mr. Ayuk, with what Silas is saying? That despite the opportunities that are there, it's very likely that we might have to struggle if at all we are able to raise the occasion and meet the demands that we see from this war. And how realistically can African countries or even the companies that are already operating on the continent be able to rise up their capacity to be able to supply the kind of gap that we see? What are you seeing from where you sit, Mr. Ayuk?
I mean, we just released our Africa Energy Chamber second quarter oil and gas reports. One of the key things that Silas is right. We do not have the capacity in Africa to provide gas to Europe. And I say this with caution. This is not because we do not have gas in Africa. Europe is at a crunch. They are going to sort themselves out because they have the money to get even more expensive gas from the United States, which is most likely going to be 3 times what they normally get from Russia. Qatar has already pledged a lot with futures in the futures market. So there's a big competition between Europe, China, and India when it comes to gas markets right now. And that is going to be even more difficult. Africa is the next part where you get cheap gas into European markets. But then you have 2 sources right now which you could ramp up gas into Europe immediately. An extension of the West African gas pipeline do go subsea through Senegal, Mauritania, and you go right up into Europe, or do the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline that goes from Wari in Nigeria, going through Niger and Algeria and Morocco. But then there are also security concerns, which I think it's overblown than anything. The big issue right now is that the big investments that are needed, going between $15 to $30 billion, that have to come into the market to really be able to drive those gas markets. It is difficult. It is tough. The other option is the ability to use floating LNGs, where you could have floating LNGs move that, but you need at least 15 months to 24 months to ramp up production. Maybe you might have to do some drilling in some of the fields to get gas there. So yes, you can get some scope of gas to Europe, but it's not that much. Right now, the most fast-track projects you're seeing right now is looking at Congo, Brazzaville, where ENI is driving that. We've seen issues, as Silas accurately said, around Tanzania and Mozambique. Mozambique security issues have slowed down, but then you would have to move fast. Silas is right on one thing. LNG projects take a lot of time to get and moving forward. Europe has designated gas green, so it has paved the way for investment, but it does not untangle the restrictions. Sometimes the Europeans shoot themselves in the foot. You want gas out of Africa, but you still have a chokehold on financing on Africa gas projects, and that is going to be very difficult. it's going to be very difficult. African countries don't have the money to ramp up the financing and drive gas-based projects. But while we're on that, there's something I want you to pay attention in. This is while you're driving this gas project, this is a good time for you to look at how you do bring in a hydrogen economy, which hydrogen is likely to replace natural gas in a post-energy transition economy. So you might want to look at doing that same infrastructure that brings in hydrogen and then drives it at the same time. So Europe, can they get gas tomorrow? No, they would not be able, because even look at the market, look at where Angola has surpassed Nigerian oil production. Africa daily oil and gas production, when you look at combined crude condensate, has dropped from 9 million. Right now we're somewhere around 7 million because of natural decline in fields and underinvestment. That's why we're even seeing high prices right now, and even within Africa. It's not just the Russian crisis; it's underinvestment and underproduction. So we are seeing a turning point in this industry, and I think the European crisis further highlights that.
Indeed. Thank you so much indeed for that insights. And I think that's very important, especially when you bring in also the issue about hydrogen economy. And I think sort of really trying to say, look, we might also be having something else there that can also be brought on board. And we should also looking at that. That's quite interesting indeed as a dimension. So with this, let me just bring in Mr. Fred Kabanda. Fred Kabanda is the head of Extractive Divisions at Africa Development Bank, where he has served since 2016. He particularly leads a very important department at the bank, that's the Resource Management and Investment Center of the ADB, which is a very significant division when it comes to regional member countries on how and on advising on how they can maximize benefits from oil and gas and mining sectors. And of course, internally within the division, is responsible for supporting other departments as well, which work on the extractive sector, including some of the frontline organizations like the EITA and the others. Mr. Kabanda has a very interesting background. He's an earth scientist, but also a development practitioner, a geologist, a teacher, but also now a development banker. And he has also written very widely on this subject. So Fred, just taking off from where all have ended, where do we go? And what are kind of the lessons that we can learn from this? And what are the African governments, for example, how can they be able to sort of ramp up the capacities that we are talking about, looking at infrastructure projects, but also are there any other significant lessons that you see from where you sit as a bank that you can be able to tell us as a continent, but also the governments that are listening in terms of how we move forward from this crisis? Fred. Fred, are you there? I think as Fred tries to sort out his connection, there are some questions perhaps maybe that I should bring to the fore. And I'll start with a question. Maybe this could be answered by Dr. Kiyama. And Silas Nyagala is asking, and he's saying, to what extent is the economy of Russia integrated with the African economy? I think you're raising this when you in your remarks when you're speaking about the global order and how the multilateral system is organized and how interconnected somehow Africa has been with Russia, but also with Ukraine. And now how this crisis means that we have to reorganize this kind of, the deck has to be somehow reorganized to ensure that some of these connectivities or some of these connections are much more productive. Dr. Kiyama.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question. Once again, to what extent is Russia's economy interdependent to Africa's, general political economy? It's one of those odd questions because when you look at Russia, one would suggest that it has almost all the resources that it has. When it comes to the various alliances, it has got more alliances in its neighborhood. And these are two neighborhoods that I would suggest. This is basically Central Asia and Eurasia. So coming to Africa is more or less far and further afield for Russia. But having said that, what then do we as Africa get from them rather than what they get from us, because they've got more resources in that particular region? For us in Africa, we are dependent to a large extent on quite a number of things. One of the things I would suggest, or I think, is decision making. Decision making in the United Nations. We know we've got only 5 nations that have got veto power in the United Nations Security Council. And in most cases, Africa has got to think about many other things when it comes up with ideas of its own, when it comes with complexities and issues that it needs to work on, which may be far-reaching than the region. So who else do we call upon? We know, of course, in this region, oftentimes you've heard that we look towards the East, and the East is not only looking at China alone, but we are looking at basically from Turkey going east, or what was initially called Constantinople going east. So in that way, we are more or less at times bedfellows when it comes to countries that do not really talk too much about our inadequacies, particularly politically. So we've got friendly nations in the East when it comes to us depending on them to vouch for us in the international system. When it comes to the voting system, we've got this large nation that can carry along with it some of the issues that we do have, including, of course, China. Let's not forget also, when it comes to interdependence, and this was from the last 2 decades, we've got BRICS. You are aware that that is basically Brazil, Russia, India, China, and to some extent South Africa. So in a way, we've got that South-South collaboration, how to uplift other nations that are struggling economically and also in times of crisis. Like now we are heading towards financial crisis or financial recession in the international system. So who else would we, call upon, given the fact that since 1994, the world opened up. It opened up. We had more nations to call upon when it came to some of our issues, but more specifically when it comes to the current issue that we are dealing with now. How then, and how do we collaborate with some of these nations? Russia has been one of those countries, including Ukraine, that provide quite a number of resources, including wheat. We know that indeed in the last month or so, quite a number of African nations were arguing that, why is it that we are feeling the pinch? What have we been eating? Why is it that we are not secure? And then we realize, oh my, wheat, we get wheat from, these 2 countries out there. So how do we renegotiate? How do we come to the point where we have to struggle and have that food security? In my mind, what I'm seeing is a situation that called upon us when we had COVID-19, when the world was closed, when it was shut, and everyone was basically saying that, this COVID came from Africa and so on and so forth. And we moved ahead. We were able to create our own industries that would seek to deal with, of course, the eventualities of the time. And this is such a time, I think this is such an opportune time for Africa to also, introspectively look at what it needs to do in terms of the resources that it has, in terms of food security, and manage it adequately without necessarily relying too much, on external actors. But having said that, we know that it's not only about food, but also the agricultural sector, more so fertilizers. We also realized, where do our fertilizers come from? We are not getting enough fertilizers because of the current war. So again, once again, in Africa, we need to rise up beyond that. We need to begin thinking about how is it that we're not even producing fertilizer in Africa? What is the problem? What gives when it comes to us going beyond that? The other thing that we have in terms of interdependence with Russia, as has been identified, besides, of course, when it comes to the energy sector, we are also collaborating in the security sector in a myriad of ways. And we are also looking out to see how do you come up with a, security treaty organization. We do not have such in Africa. We have, of course, our own, security agencies that have come together, and we've got, the standby forces that have got to look forward in terms of if we had any insecurity in Africa, for whatever reason, how would those security forces deal with a certain issue? And as a scholar, of course, we usually look at comparing how nations are able to work towards that. And of course, there has been clear indication that the world is strategically moving, or there are certain tilts and shifts in certain ways. Once again, Africa is always at the center. We are never out of the game. Actually, we are at the center. And in most cases, we are the ones who have got to decide where will the world tilt. Because in a way, we've got so much to offer in terms of providing support to some of these nations that we are dealing with. So in my mind, interdependence between ourselves and Russia is there. And to a large extent, like I said, they do not necessarily depend on certain resources from us because they've got their own neighborhood, that is Central Asia and Eurasia. And we come last, but nevertheless, it's our opportunity now to strategically identify the areas that we need to collaborate more in, particularly because we talked about human security earlier, not necessarily just military security or the use of force, but also other aspects of security like communal security, food security, and the like. Thank you so much.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Kyamba, especially mentioning that last bit of it in terms of how we have to slowly begin reconfiguring ourselves as a continent and looking broadly in terms of the existing kind of multilateral systems as they were, and trying to see how we strengthen those. And I can see now that Mr. Fred has joined us. Fred, did you hear me? And now, are you able now to speak, perhaps on the question that I asked, but also just from any angle that you want to take it? I think you've had Dr. Kyamba, you have had Mr. Ayuk, and you've had Mr. Silas. And I think what's coming out through, at least from the three speakers, is that yes, there's a potential, but there seems to be some kind of struggles when it comes to capacity. What are you hearing? And if there's anything that you want to please take it up from there, Mr. Fred.
Thank you, Moses. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now hear you.
Perfect. Yes. The advantage with coming last is that most of the difficult things like diplomacy and security are already covered. You asked about lessons, and before I go into the lessons we picked from Russia, I would like to thank NRGI for inviting us to this important event. Thank you so much. I would also like to set at the forefront two issues. One, that the conflict is still ongoing since February 2022, and it may therefore be too early for us to determine the full impact and therefore the full lessons for Africa. The second precaution is that lessons will apply differently to different countries. And so some of the issues or examples I may use may be different and applicable to different countries within Africa, especially because Africa is not uniform to all through. Now that said, we can also pick some lessons even now as the conflict goes on. And one of them that NGA clearly highlighted is the energy security. But we would like to come from a different angle, look at this aspect of energy security. In my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, the conflict is actually about extractive natural resources. This is because a third of all the oil and gas produced from Russia goes through Ukraine. And so there is an interest of Russia being able to actually, control what happens in Ukraine. Secondly, the market for the extractives from Europe is basically coming from Russia. And so there would actually be no sanctions if they did not have this much resource. And so how has Russia acted? So even with the sanctions, their extractive resources continue to be exploited and used to provide for the country. And here, Africa must learn a thing or two. One, we must stop selling all our raw materials in their raw form without processing for the domestic market. Local supply chains and local operators must be strengthened to avoid the scenarios we saw that impacted us during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns, where the supply chains were broken, operations were lacking, and this actually is one of the factors that has led to the decline of oil production from Africa, which has not gone back to its original numbers before COVID. Local content is something that is very critical. It creates employment, but also service providers come in and get opportunities. In order for us to learn a thing or two from Russia, we see that indeed they do not rely a lot on expatriates to come up from across or abroad to come and maintain their wells or undertake operations. And this is what we have got to do. And we have seen some movement in this line in Africa, especially in the licensing aspects of Angola and Nigeria, where marginal fields have recently been licensed to local companies as they build their capacity. One thing that if we did not know, we should learn now is that it is clear that Africa is low priority in global issues. And I say this because whereas the Russia-Ukraine conflict is ongoing and has attracted a lot of attention, there are similarly other conflicts where people are dying in Africa, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, and these are not receiving as much global attention. The current talk we hear is that, yes, we need to find money to rebuild Ukraine. And these same pledges are indeed those that have failed to honor the climate mitigation funds that they promised. We also saw this during COVID-19, where vaccines, were prioritized. We need to first give our people first dose. The first dose went. They said, no, let's give second dose and then booster doses before considering selling to other people in Africa. So Africa really needs to work on their own survival. We should not expect support from others. And in the extractives, one thing that really needs to be done is to build local expertise to manage operations and execute projects. Why do I say this? We have seen that some of the oil majors are recalibrating, realigning their Africa assets. For example, Shell has reduced their global upstream to 9 hubs with only 1 in Africa. Total Energies are selective in finding low-cost and high-value projects. We know that in Angola, BP and Eni are also realigning. In other words, we may see this eventually leading to what other people are terming stranded assets, and we must be able to prepare in order to take up these activities by ourselves. And so gradually, we must be able to fill this gap. And it is not going to start in Africa because we see this happened in the North Sea. 10 years ago, specifically about 2014, there was zero production from private sector. Today, private sector, smaller companies produce from the North Sea to a level of about 10%. So there's a call for action. And the call for action is for us to be able to work together. Countries will not manage on their own. They need to have regional and continental content, so to say, instead of local content. And this can apply in licensing, can apply in goods and services, in technology, and many other things. We also note that governance must, improve. It is not going to be business as usual for governments that produce 200,000 barrels of oil per day, 500,000 barrels, even up to 1.8 or 2 million barrels of oil per day, for them to have populations that are really the poorest in the world. We must deploy our resources and reprioritize. And there are two kinds of resources here I'm talking about. Those we inherit, the minerals, oil and gas, but we can also go ahead and use, the human resources, educate them, and create value from these resources we inherit. And the main cause we have seen, or the main reason for not doing this that we have seen, is that there is lack of capital. But in economics, all resources are limited. We must know this. And so we need to be innovative. We continue to see governments sending their pension funds, sending their insurance funds, central bank reserves abroad for interests of up to 2%. Clearly, we must be able to look at this much better. I know that in the beginning, there was indication of the AFCTA, and I will not go into details, but this is an opportunity to create new markets, and numbers are out there. We must take advantage of our demographics. But there is some caution. Let me just provide some caution before I conclude. The appetite to export due to increased prices must be tamed. I have seen examples in countries where there are refineries that are redundant today because they have no supply of oil. And yet the oil is exported. Why? Because the price is very high. This is not something that we should be able to go for. The second caution is on rushed development. And here, I would just give you an example which is out there. You can also go and check it. It's not information that we hide, but the example of the Cinque oil field in Mauritania is a very good one. Discovery were confirmed to be commercial in 2004. Production started in February 2006. The price was very good because it had moved from $30 a barrel in 2003 and was gradually climbing until it reached the climax in 2008 of $140 a barrel. So there was a rush to, catch the market. So production starts 75,000 barrels of oil per day in May of 2006. The company now puts up, all the facilities they want, and to their surprise, they reached peak May, but in August, production drops very significantly to about 20,000 barrels of oil per day. Eventually, it goes down and down up to $7,000 or 7,000 barrels of oil per day. This meant that the investment that had been put in place could never be recovered because it was oversized. Nobody understood the reservoirs, and so it is, timely now that we should not be able to rush, and we could fall in the same trap. I will not go into the LNG, but LNG is a similar example. NG here has highlighted that. I will only highlight another caution on the service costs. The total break-even price comes because of CapEx and OpEx. And the CapEx is dependent on the investments you have made in exploration, but also the development costs. And the development costs will change depending on the oil prices. If somebody is signing a contract when the oil prices are very high, it is likely that the services will also cost you high. And so we have to be cautious. As we sign service contracts today, we need to make sure this is put into perspective. And so to conclude, basically, we need to plan such that externalities do not continue to significantly impact Africa, like it has been in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was global, but also for the Russia-Ukraine event, which seemed, not to have, should not have affected us. And one of the things we have to take advantage is the AFCFTA and start adding value to most of our natural resources. And talking about adding value, we have to take advantage of our green minerals in the low carbon energy transition. And this is why we are starting to develop a strategy for Africa's green minerals going forward. Thank you very much, Moses, for the opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Fred, for those very, very quite exciting insights indeed, and especially when it comes to matters that you think, especially the caution. I think that's very important in terms of really understanding, also mitigating the appetite, but also some of the cautions and the risks that could be there. But maybe my last question to you before you go would be, are you seeing any shifts within the African governments in terms of towards this direction? Do you see any kind of, move shifts that sort of really demonstrate or tend to show that there could be some kind of, positive shifts into the right direction? For example, when it comes to matters infrastructure, when it comes to matters developing refineries, when it comes to matters export, import promotion, all these kind of things that you have talked about that need to be taken in place. From the side of the bank, do you see some of these either in the projects or either in, some of the policy circles that you interact with? And if you're not seeing this, what do you think is the problem?
Yes, thank you, Moses. I think we really need infrastructure in order to be able to work together. In other words, to interconnect the regions. And infrastructure is indeed very, very critical, because you may already know that Nigeria is having a lot of natural gas. And natural gas to get to the market will require either a pipeline or, to have LNG. But if it is to be used to interconnect through Africa, it would be best to have, a pipeline. And we see some movement in this direction, because the Nigeria-Algeria gas pipeline is on the table. Discussions have been undertaken, and I think NGM mentioned this, because the last conference that was in Niger actually, was very critical on this aspect. So we see some movement in that line. But in my opinion, I think we are moving slower, and this is because of the limitations we have had in the past of not being able to finance what are called the dirty, energy sources. So these, what has been called as dirty, has hindered financing of these aspects. And so we must be able to, go around this. Somebody cannot say that in Europe, for instance, it is natural gas is now a green energy, but in other parts of the world, it is still dirty. So we must be able to look at this. And this is why I was saying, we must be able to act and be able to move together. And the action has to come from within ourselves. How can we create the market for, the domestic people in Africa to have access to energy? I mean, 600 million people clearly to be in darkness is not acceptable today. And we must be able to work towards these. One of the key aspects that we look at in the bank is, yes, we would like to finance the energy that will also be competitive. And I can just mention why we are not supporting coal at the moment. Coal, if you we are going to develop a new coal plant today, it will take you some time to build it, maybe 3 years or so. But the lifespan is about 30 or so years. And so it would mean that, indeed, for you to start selling the power and recover your costs, you will require a long time. Our thinking is that, there are new energy sources that are becoming cheaper and cheaper along the way. And so we need to look at that from that perspective. So that is the way we look at it. We look at both the economics, but also the aspects that relate to the low carbon energy transition. But natural gas is indeed something that we support, and we have just supported some development projects in Mozambique with some financing, and this is indeed the way to go. But negotiations must be done better, such that you are not exporting, all your natural gas to the market without any domestic sources being, provided for your country. We have seen contracts where companies were telling governments that, no, you are far from the coast and our production is offshore. So it is very expensive for you to get this gas, and so it's cheaper for us to export it. But such negotiations must be improved, and governments must insist on such, supplies. I'm not sure if I've tried to answer your question, but there are many, many areas that we could go into in this area.
Great, indeed. I think you have sufficiently addressed it, of course, given the time. And I think the point that you raised when it comes to, the importance of negotiations, but also being very strategic when it comes to infrastructure development, which, as you point, definitely could be some kind of, an eye-opener. One question to Silas, and I think this coming from the audience, and someone says, look, Silas, African leaders have the temerity to sign a lot of contracts that have not been given enough time to simmer before commencing such activities. This could be an opportunity for African countries with resources coveted globally to strike deals, but what would be your thoughts on the readiness of such countries in seizing such opportunities in a sustainable manner? And I think this also connected the point that Mr. Kabanda has raised. Silas, what are your thoughts on that in a minute?
Thank you very much, Moses. I wouldn't really be able to speak about countries' capacities to sign the contracts, but I would probably address it in terms of the importance of having really, robust governance framework that would allow for, these deals actually to be, to ensure that there is kind of oversight mechanisms to check on these deals before they are actually being signed, and also build the capacity of institutions that would be able to negotiate good deals before they are signed. So, yeah, without carrying out like a research on the capacity assessment of each country, I think what is important is to ensure that these robust governance mechanisms are in place. I mentioned that without that, there is a huge opportunity for rollback of good governance standards in signing of these deals. I think that is what I would probably say, but also their capacities in terms of if the countries have a political will to negotiate, good contracts, and sign good deals. It is important to, use also the capacity that is available within the country, but also even finding that out outside the country. Yeah, maybe I stop there. There was another question, definitely.
Great indeed. No, I think I can see, Mr. You want to come in on this? I saw your hand as well, but perhaps maybe as you answer that question as well, you can also take another one, Mr. Ayuk. Someone is saying Russia is the third energy producer globally, and the energy sector is regulated by government that produce the energy. So how can Africa position itself, since the world is shifting powers globally indirectly? Perhaps maybe you can also have a comment on that. I know that Dr. Kiamba spoke a lot more about that, but if you have a few aspects on that. I also have another question that I'll ask somebody else to take, Mr. Ayuk.
Moses, can you just repeat the question? I couldn't hear you well.
Yes, it says Russia is the third energy producer globally, and the energy sector is regulated by government that produce energy. How can Africa position itself since the world is shifting powers globally, indirectly? I'm not so sure I get a question, but if you have got it, please try to see how you can answer it. But I thought that perhaps maybe Dr. Kiamba has spoken to that, but if you have some insights as well, you can share that after you making your rejoinder on the previous one that Silas was talking to.
I think, yes, I think Dr. Kiamba alluded a little bit with that, and I would kind of think it this way. I think the discussion we're having today really speaks to that, how we get positioned in Africa. I don't think we need to get governments regulating energy a lot. Free market enterprise is still the best path to prosperity. we should not forget that the more we get government try to get involved in markets and regulating markets, regulating competition, then you are really getting into not uncharted waters, but waters that have not really helped us in the past. I do think we have to also be very careful with these discussions, not to, when we talk about contract negotiations and everything, I come more from a market-driven perspective where you say governments have to put skin in the game. You do not go into negotiations not prepared. Preparations prevents frustrations. African governments cannot be thinking that they are going to be babysat in negotiations. You spend more money paying per diems and paying government officials and paying all these people to fly to Europe and fly to America and Dubai for negotiations, but you don't have money to pay lawyers and petroleum economists and petroleum geologists or gas economists or power economists to do the critical work that needs to be done. It's all a mindset thing. And then, so in the end, you get the results you want. So you only get out what you put in. So I don't think we should be looking at that. Corporate companies are not charitable organizations. They are like predators. They go out for profit. So when they come into negotiations, they have done their homework. They have understood what needs to be done and they have mapped out those strategies. So we need to, this is time when we need to get back to the drawing board. And then we also need to look at the mirror. You know, my mama always said mirrors are not just to reflect what you see, it is to correct what you see. We need to correct what we see. And I couldn't agree more with my brother Fred. This is time for Africa content. This is time for us to look at intra-Africa trade more, but then drive that with energy. We're not talking a lot about intra-Africa energy trade, which that should be what we need to be looking at. I do sit on the technical advisory committees for OPEC and on the leadership on the OPEC committees. What are you looking at when we look at our outlook reports? We are going to see the markets shift so much. The growth you're going to see with energy usage, whether it's oil, whether it is gas, whether it's anything, it's not going to happen in OECD countries. It's going to happen in emerging markets, and Africa is going to be it. So you think about this, 2050, 2060, Africa, you're going to see 2.1 to 2.3 billion people. That means energy access is going to be big. So our ability to connect Africa, whether it's with pipelines that can transport gas, or even embracing a low carbon economy, but that infrastructure needs to come and needs to come more. That's why I'm happy Fred is here. When Fred gets back to the bank, they should be even more proactive in saying, we're not going to ban all fossil fuels. I understand what Fred says when it comes to coal, but then this is not a time for us to ban financing around oil or around gas projects or anything, because at the end of the day, we need to have a different kind of discussions. What is happening in Russia has to be a wake-up call for us, because if we are choked out of energy resources, we are going to see scarcity that's going to affect us with food production. It's going to affect us with austerity measures around African governments. And that idea that 35 to 80% of Africans are going to be driving a Tesla by 2030, when 60% to 70% don't have any kind of electricity. I think it's a luxury belief and a fancy idea that's not a lot of African elites sitting in their nice fancy offices and talking to their friends at Oxford and London. They think that's the real world. The real Africa today that you have to look at with energy and energy crisis that is coming across this continent, picking up on what we've seen in Russia, is the coup d'etats happening. We had gone for about 10 years, we hadn't seen any coup d'etats. What are we seeing right now? There was an attempted coup in Guinea-Bissau. There was a coup in Guinea-Conakry. There was a coup in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Sudan, and you're going to continue seeing uprisings across Africa. You just saw a big uprising in Sri Lanka that came out of energy. So while we're having this, our luxury and elitist beliefs, we need to get real back on the ground, and it's going to be market. Nobody's going to do it for us. We need to get right back on the room and start moving. And I close with this. our way of negotiating and our way of looking at resource nationalism and this thinking that they are coming to get us and it has held us back. And that's the same thing that Russia is going through and Europe is going through that. In Uganda, one of my favorite countries, I love Uganda. I'm a big fan of the East Africa crude oil pipelines, even when some people don't like it. And we're going to back it here from the chamber to get out the local content initiatives there. But that discovery was made in 2006 at the same time when you had Jubilee in Ghana. The Ghanaians started producing 2 years or 3 years later. In Uganda, till today, now we're getting stuck on arguing about whether it is moral or immoral with some crazy pastor from the US. If we don't really move ourselves fast, that's how you lost value creation in 15 years. We need to turn it around. We need to super drive it. Young people around Africa are not going to be waiting for us to be speaking big English. We need to mobilize support and get on the ground and move our people up.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Yuk. I think that's a very passionate way of actually ending your submission. And I think the points that you raised are very important, and I hope that they can get us to begin thinking really quite strategically and strongly, and in terms of how we approach these issues. I know that time is up for us, and perhaps maybe I know that there are a lot of questions and there's a lot of interest, but I'm also aware that time is running up. Perhaps maybe one last question that I can take from the queue is that, well, one is that someone is saying, well, with the new EU declaration, the status of gas as climate friendly for energy, can that be an opportunity for investment in Africa as well in this area, despite expected economic downturn? And there's also a final question. I know that, yes, and there's also a comment from one of our colleagues, I think. He says, well, the crisis in Russia is not about control of the resources or the supply chain. It is something else. And in fact, in his own opinion, it's a crisis between democracy and autocracy. Does anybody want to maybe to just share some perspectives on that question, especially the one from the EU? And then the final one will be, I'll take a last one, and this also goes to Kavanda, and he's saying Africa has been a feedstock to the North development and a footstool when it comes to equitable contribution of the world's health. The ideologies of the new clean energy have been hatched from without experts reaching out to them. And he says, what will be your advice to African leaders to sustain they will make the most of these openings to make the African resource landscape have its own place in the relevancy of the global scale? I think that with those questions, perhaps maybe then we shall bring to an end. I think maybe there was also another question about how about the possibilities in coal bed methane and blue hydrogen. Silas, maybe you'll take that as a final call as we bring this discussion to an end. Sadly, because of the time, I think we can continue, but I'm very sure that the ideas that have been brought forward are very productive enough to enable us to continue the discussion even in our own private settings. So first, Kavanda, do you want to take that? Then Silas, and perhaps maybe Dr. Kiamba, you give us some final remarks after those two interjections.
Yes, Moses. If I could just come back to this question on the opportunities in the green energy transition, if that's the question that I understood. Yes, I see that there are opportunities, especially in areas where we need to, reduce our deforestation, because, like a lot of people use biomass for cooking. Until we are able to develop natural gas and use this as a clean cooking energy, we will continue to deforestate and therefore create more havoc in this climate change. That's one area. But two, let me just add some emphasis on the critical minerals and adding value. We have just done a study with Bloomberg in collaboration with the DR Congo government and UNECA on what are the opportunities that DR Congo could actually come in to use their cobalt for adding value and being able to manufacture some battery precursors. The results were amazing. We compared manufacturing of the battery precursors in DR Congo to the US, to Poland, and to China, 3 different countries on different continents. The result is that in DR Congo, it is 3 times much cheaper to start production of a battery precursor compared to the others. But the good thing is that in addition to this, we may not have the electric vehicles tomorrow, but we have the advantage of the 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. And this is what we are talking about in the Battery Council that has just been established for discussion of how we can take this forward. This study has also been followed up with agreements of cooperation between DR Congo and Zambia in preparing a factory for battery precursors. And just to put these battery precursors into context, in 2025, the total value of mining the critical minerals will be estimated at $11 billion globally. This sounds like it's good and big. But if you move just one step to refine the critical minerals, it moves from 11 billion to 44 billion. And when you go to precursors manufacturing, it goes 271 billion. Eventually, it goes to 8.1 trillion. So there is value here. And so we can look at the green revolution, so to say, as an opportunity for us to be able to move forward in these areas. Thank you, Moses.
Thank you indeed, Frederick, especially for giving that as a very practical example, which can actually, where Africa can sort of really be the leader of the world. And I think also thinking outside the box, Mr. Nuke has spoken about, we can't think about driving Teslas realistically because the level of poverty and exclusion is still quite high. And we will still also have some other pressing needs that need to be sort of really overcome. But perhaps being very creative in terms of what we can have and how we can use it. And the example of a 2-wheeler or a 3-wheeler, which has become one clear image of what Africa is when it comes to motorization, is an example. It's a very good example. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it sort of really gives us that kind of impetus in terms of thinking in a new way within this kind of new framework that we are existing in. Now, let me just give over to Silas to sort of really make a few remarks, and I think also you can also share with us your parting shots as we bring this webinar to a conclusion. And again, as I said before, Silas comes, I think our panelists will be happy to interact with anybody on our audience who wants to reach out to them to carry forward this discussion. You must have also heard a lot about critical minerals. I want also to say that NRHI, in collaboration with other partners, will be hosting another webinar on critical minerals on the 3rd of August, and we shall be sending out that invite shortly. Silas.
Thank you very much, Moses. Maybe just to pick on the question on green gas, and I think Fred has also touched on that. I think that gas is one of the issues or energy sources that so far there hasn't been really a consensus. Many tend to call it transition energy, and others really consider it as a fossil fuel and therefore not clean energy. So I think this, in my view, really sends a clear message to Africa as how do we want to define gas for our future socioeconomic development. Definitely, Africa, and if you read, the documents like the Africa Energy Outlook, it's clear that gas is really for Africa development, especially industrial development. Gas is important, and therefore Europe defines it as a green gas. Definitely there are issues of technology that would actually reduce, methane content in the natural gas to make it less, carbon emission. But still, I think the issue here is what is the best for, Africa in terms of using its natural gas. Coal is clearly, kind of out of question for a long time. I think currently there are ongoing discussions about phasing out coal in many areas. But the question is there any kind of mechanism that could help, coal-producing countries really to address, the phase out? We see what is happening in South Africa in trying to phase out coal through climate financing. Maybe this could also be an opportunity for Africa to consider, in this area. So yeah, with that, I think I will stop there. But clearly, Africa should use this opportunity to think about its own kind of future energy access, energy security, and energy needs for many millions of Africans who do not have access to that. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Silas, for that. And I think also pointing out, the discussion around green, whether gas is green, and of course, the perspectives around the divergency in terms of what should be the approach when it comes to gas, and of course, the significant role that it plays, or it should be able to be playing when it comes to the future energy mix for the continent. I saw, Mr. Ayub, you had a hand up. You wanted to make a short comment before we
Moses,
close?
a short comment on gas, and I think Silas raised a very important issue, that I think it's critical, something that we should be looking more and more around Africa on this discussion. Gas is green. It's low carbon. Why have we not done so much with gas? When the big multinational oil companies came to Africa in the past, they came looking for oil that would go into European and American refineries. We did not get oil. They were not looking for gas, but we still have a lot of gas. That's why you see a lot of gas being found in, it wasn't like Mozambique didn't have gas in the past. It just was not what the big corporations were looking for and the market was looking for. In December, they said gas was bad. Russia comes with a war, gas become green. But at the same time, we still have a block on financing when it comes there. So you've not untangled that financing crunch that you're really seeing. And I think for Africa, if we have to really drive that and create energy security for Africans, we need to look at that. Why is gas so important? We can build urea, ammonia, NPK, fertilizer plants, drive up agriculture, create jobs, create opportunities for young people. And that is really when energy still starts being, but also gas to power projects. You can't tell a country like South Africa to phase out or shut down coal mines when at the same time Europe is importing more coal from South Africa at the same time. And the country is riddled with load shedding, no electricity and anything. And this is Africa's most industrialized nation. You cripple manufacturing and industrialization in Africa. You will be going to China to beg. China will be laughing at you. You'll be going to China to buy more and really get more. We need to be thinking about Africa first. Africa first. That is what our thinking needs to be. And while we go into COP, we need to be asking for a just energy transition, not just binding to what they're telling us to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed, Ayub, for that very emphatic emphasis, especially on this dichotomy and the divergence when it comes to, the role of gas. My final question, as we bring this to a close, I know, friends, that we have really gone past the time, but I think the discussion is quite exciting, and I'm also trying to sort of ask this question for our colleagues who will be joining and who will be watching the video. My last question to you, Dr. Kyiamba, I think you're the right person to be answering this question, is is it possible and is it practical to have an intra-Africa energy trade? Which sounds like an exciting idea that we are getting from this conversation, but I think from our viewers, they're thinking, could be someday there is some delicate balance that needs to be done, but perhaps if we thought about this could be something that could also be a panacea to some of the challenges that we face. And maybe, God forbid, if we had another war happening on the continent or somewhere else, this could be something that could help us from stemming us from the kind of challenges that we have faced in this crisis. Do you agree, or do you have some perspectives on this?
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for that question. Quite heavy in terms of, is it possible for us to have inter-energy trade? I think it is possible. The only problem that, of course, also the question raises is the fact that we are segmented. We've got our own specific national interests. And we have seen a majority of African countries not even agreeing on simple, trade practice, so this would require quite a lot of effort. It can be done, but it requires that, just in the way we have pooled energy in the region, particularly when it comes to hydroelectric energy. So it is a possibility. We can use the same framework. We can use the same ways and methods to achieve that in Africa. But as Ayuka said, it's time for Africa to just grow up and not think about what the rest of the world is doing and get, too much interference in Africa. As he was talking, and the more I was thinking, because I thought now would be opening another can of worms in terms of even the time extension given to us, is that yes, we talk about green energy in Africa, but that just came recently, almost recently. I think most of our countries were moving towards having nuclear energy. So what are the plans, and the transition for the countries that were thinking about nuclear energy and how we can, survive using that form of energy, and how we are going to incorporate green energy, which is only not about, the gases, as it were, but also we are talking about wind energy, we are talking about geothermal, we are talking about the waves in our oceans and so on. How to adopt those as we think about the future, and how we can think about not relying heavily too much on these countries that we, are getting the oil and the gas from. Thank you so much, Moses.
Thank you so much indeed. I think it has been such a very exciting discussion, and I want to thank all my distinguished panelists and all of you who have joined us from across the world, I must say, for this very exciting webinar on this kind of crisis which has been unfolding in front of us, unfortunately with very catastrophic consequences, loss of life, economic shocks, and all the kind of challenges that we face as a continent. It has been my pleasure hosting you, and on behalf of the Africa Development Bank and the Natural Resources Governance Institute, I want to thank all of you for taking some time to join us. And again, as we normally say on the African continent, when we do it again, please be free to join us. As I mentioned, our next webinar, which we'll be also organizing as NRHI, will be on critical minerals, and we shall be sending out an invite, and we look forward to having you. With those remarks, I want to say thank you. May God bless you and have a good day.